fired for theft I didn't commit, but over time I realized who was behind it. I worked at the company for like almost 6 years. It wasn't some startup or a temporary stunt. It was a normal, stable logistics business with large turnover, warehouses, and permanent contracts. I started there as a regular operator. Eventually rose as a senior manager, and at some point I began to understand the processes better than half the management. Honestly, I was sure I had a future there. A secure career, a stable income, gradual growth, everything seemed predictable. As it turned out, it was too predictable to be true. It all fell apart on our ordinary Tuesday. I was summoned to the director's office, and I didn't even tense up. Such calls happened regularly. Usually it meant either a new project or the urgent need to clean up someone else's mistakes. But as soon as I walked into the office, I immediately sensed something was wrong. There were already 3 people sitting there: the director, an HR employee, and an unfamiliar man in a suit. The atmosphere was cold and tense, devoid of the usual formalities and humour. They asked me to sit down, and then after a short pause, the director calmly said that the company had reason to believe I was involved in the theft of funds. For a moment, I didn't even understand what he was talking about. The wording sounded so absurd that my brain simply refused to process it. HR immediately started talking about accounting discrepancies, transactions authorized by me, and an internal audit. I couldn't help but chuckle because it sounded like a bad joke, but no one smiled back. The unfamiliar man introduced himself as the person conducting the internal audit and confidently declared that all digital traces pointed to me. I asked to see evidence, but they refused, citing internal procedures. At that moment, for the first time, I felt not just irritation, but a cold, unpleasant feeling inside, as if the decision had already been made, and this whole conversation was just a formality. I was suspended that same day. 2 days later, I was fired under Article 10. The first few weeks after that were difficult, and I tried to prove something, asked for at least clarification on the details, to no avail. Moreover, they made it clear to me that if I started making a fuss, the matter could reach the police. I had neither the resources nor the connections to fight a company of that caliber. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the stigma. No one had formally accused me publicly, but such things spread quickly within the industry. And if a suspicion of embezzlement appears in your file, no one wants to investigate. I started looking for a job, and at first everything went well. Interviews, conversations, interest. But as soon as it came to the security check, everything stopped. Just silence. And within a month, my savings had run out. Within 2 months, I was borrowing money. Within 3, I had moved to a cheaper apartment, and all this time, the same thought kept swirling in my head. If it wasn't me, then someone else did, and that someone else was still working quietly. The answer came unexpectedly. Almost 4 months later, a former colleague with whom I had a normal but not close relationship wrote to me, and he suggested a meeting and said it was important. Even at the meeting, it was clear the conversation would be serious. He was visibly nervous and clearly took a long time to decide. He said he knew it wasn't me. I dismissed it because it was obvious, but he clarified he knew who did it, and that's when the conversation became truly important. He mentioned the name Igor. I immediately knew who he was talking about. This man had joined the company about a year before this whole thing and had risen too quickly. It seemed strange at the time, but nothing more. A colleague showed me an old screenshot of the logs he'd saved back when he'd noticed the oddities. I examined it. It showed transactions allegedly performed by me, but the login times didn't coincide with my shifts, and this was the first real clue. He admitted he hadn't spoken up earlier because he'd been told not to interfere. From that moment on, the situation changed. Before, I'd been just someone who'd been thrown out. Now I had a starting point. I began carefully gathering information, indirectly without making accusations, simply talking to former colleagues, asking questions, comparing notes. Gradually, a pattern began to emerge. Igor wasn't a lone wolf. He'd been promoted by the deputy director, a man who rarely showed up but oversaw key processes. And it was after Igor's arrival that the financial discrepancies began. Through an IT acquaintance, I realized exactly how I'd been framed. There had been no hack. Everything turned out to be much simpler and therefore more dangerous. All they had to do was access my work computer while I was away and perform the necessary operations. So the system recorded everything as my actions. This explained why the evidence seemed so convincing. But even with this understanding, I had no direct evidence, only logic and circumstantial evidence. That wasn't enough. So I decided not to push through. I found a job at another company, smaller and more modest, but in the same field. Gradually I restored my financial situation, paid off my debts, and returned to normal life. From the outside, it looked like I'd simply resigned myself to it and moved on. But inside, I wasn't letting go. A few months later, an opportunity arose. Our new company started working with the same supplier as the old one, and at some point I ran into Igor in person. He clearly wasn't expecting to see me. I tried to act calm, but the tension was palpable. And I didn't press directly, just gently hinted that I knew more than he let on. His reaction spoke volumes. He became nervous and at one point abruptly said that it was my own fault. It was a mistake. A person who's innocent doesn't react that way. After that, I found another former employee, an accountant who left the company on a sour note. He confirmed that internal fraud had been going on for a long time and that the same people were involved. But most importantly, he explained why no one was speaking out. Fear. People were afraid of losing their jobs, their reputations, their stability. And that's when I realized what the whole scheme was based on. Not on force or perfect cover-up, but on the fact that no one dared to speak out. I collected everything I could, logs, testimony, coincidences, conversations, and I passed it on not to the company itself, but higher up, to where it couldn't be simply swept under the rug. The results didn't appear immediately, but they were inevitable. Inspections, audits, and internal investigations began. Gradually the situation came to light. The deputy director was fired. Igor also lost his job. Later it became clear that the matter wasn't limited to my story. There were far more serious violations. Sometime later I received a call from that same company inviting me to meet. The conversation took place in the same office where I'd been effectively accused. Only this time the tone was completely different. They acknowledged a mistake and offered compensation. I agreed, but on the condition that I officially confirm my innocence. And then when I left the building, I felt neither triumph nor joy, rather a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't so much revenge as the restoration of justice. I hadn't destroyed their system. It had collapsed on its own the moment people stopped blindly believing in it. And perhaps the most important conclusion I've drawn, In such stories, the winner isn't the one who's stronger, but the one who persists the longest and continues to piece together the truth, even when it seems like it won't change anything.